Thanks, Prof. Call, for the kind introduction. Can I have my slide, please? Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jean from University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, and one of the co-investigators in SEANUTS II, Malaysia. Today, I would like to share with you on what's next in SEANUTS II in terms of physical activity of children. You probably already know about when and where SEANUTS II took place, so I hope to enlighten you on what, how, and why for the physical activity assessment in SEANUTS II. In my presentation, I'll cover what is physical activity and the activity patterns of children. Why is it important to be physically active? Why is it important to measure physical activity in children's survey? And finally, how, in terms of general approach and SEANUTS II approach in physical activity measurement in children. So physical activity is predominantly defined as any bodily movement that results in contractions of skeletal muscles and increase of energy expenditure above resting level. More broadly, physical activity involves people moving, acting, and performing within culturally specific spaces and contexts, and is influenced by a unique array of interests, emotion, ideas, and instructions, and relationship. I like this new, more inclusive definition of physical activity as it emphasizes that physical activity is both complex and dynamic in nature. Physical activity can be described or measured in multiple quantitative and qualitative dimensions. When we talk about physical activity, we can describe the mode or type of physical activity, the amount of physical activity in terms of frequency, duration, and intensity, and also the domain or context of where, who, when, why, and in what condition physical activity takes place. For example, let's try to describe the physical activity of this child in this picture who is wearing a green shirt. To describe his physical activity comprehensively, we say that the child plays football as the type of physical activity. Every weekdays, 5 times a week for frequency, for approximately 30 minutes in duration. During his game, he often breathed harder and developed a light sweat after the game, so he was likely doing a moderate intensity activity. Context-wise, he enjoys playing football outdoor with his neighbor friend in a nearby field. So when we think of physical activity of children, we associate with both pre-planned and opportunistic movement with at least light intensity, such as walking to school, to moderate and vigorous activities such as jumping rope, playing tag, swimming, climbing, and dancing to music. Children's physical activity differs substantially from us adults in the sense that their activity pattern is typically sporadic, spontaneous, and intermittent in nature. This makes profiling of children's physical activity a little tricky. Typically, bouts of physical or vigorous activity is short, it's less than 10 seconds, and often interspersed with frequent rest periods of longer duration. Physical activity of children also vary considerably from day to day, depending on whether the child is having school terms or holidays. Their physical activity also depends on the weather, and it depends on the social and physical environment in which children live and play. So why is it important to be physically active for children? There are multiple physiological and psychological benefits. So greater amounts and higher intensity of physical activity are associated with better cardiorespiratory and muscular fitness, cardiometabolic health, and musculoskeletal health. Regular physical activity also promotes healthy weight and therefore have protective effect on adiposity. In addition, physical activity has the positive effect on cognitive functions and academic outcomes of children, for example, their school performance, memory, and executive function. Also, often not given enough acknowledgement is that physical activity provides opportunities to be fun, to have fun, to develop cooperation and teamwork, and reduce antisocial behaviors among children, among many other social benefits. We know that physical activity is incredibly important as it can yield benefits spanning generations. A child who is currently physically active will have improved health in their future and pass on the healthy habits to the next generation. A Lancet series reported that, unfortunately, globally, 81% of 11 to 17 years old do not meet the recommendation for physical activity. That means that 4 in 5 children and adolescents are doing less than 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity activity or being active for less than 60 minutes on 5 days per week. As you can see in this figure, among the 4 SEANUTS countries except for Thailand, the prevalence of insufficient physical activity is higher compared to global average, and the trend has not improved over the last 2 decades. What about physical activity level of younger children? In SEANUTS II, we use questionnaire supplemented by pedometers in a subsample of children to gain some insights on the physical activity of Malaysian children. Our study showed that only 40% of preschoolers achieve active play recommendation of more than 2 hours daily. Among school children, similar to the global report, 85% of the children, school-aged children 7 to 12 years, do not meet the recommendation for daily pedometer step counts. This high prevalence of physical inactivity is a pressing concern, as inactive children are likely to become inactive adults. SEANUTS II study group therefore viewed that physical activity as an important component to measure in nutrition survey. As physical activity is the most variable component of energy expenditure, measuring physical activity allows us researchers to estimate energy expenditure from physical activity and therefore allowing us to account for one of the key factors that influence dietary intake and nutritional status of children. Other than that, measuring physical activity allows us to monitor trend and adherence to physical activity recommendation and therefore provide the much needed evidence to develop strategies and programs to improve physical activity of children. A central question to this is, how do we select tools to assess physical activity? Generally, there are 2 main approaches to measure physical activity, namely subjective and objective assessment. As nicely summarized in this figure by Dolman and colleagues, the selection of physical activity tool is decided by purpose of the study, by the validity of the tools, that is for the desired measurement outcomes, and the context in which the tool is going to be used, such as the sample size, cost, and availability of resources. And all these factors have been considered when we are selecting the tools for SEANUTS II. The ideal physical activity assessment method would measure all dimensions in all domains. However, no such method currently exists, and there is no gold standard for measuring physical activity. Therefore, like in SEANUTS I, the study group wanted to select valid instruments that allow us to measure sporadic and intermittent nature of children's physical activity and the one that can capture most dimensions of physical activity. The solution was to use questionnaire in combination with an objective measure such as accelerometer so that we can capture intensity alongside contextual information on physical activity of children. For questionnaire-based assessment of physical activity, in SEANUTS II, we use age-specific questionnaire that are proxy reported by parents of younger children or self-reported by children themselves. To measure adherence to the latest physical activity guidelines, for each version of the physical activity questionnaire, we incorporated new summary questions to assess directly whether or not the children are meeting guidelines. For example, we asked parents of the preschoolers, does your child spend at least 3 hours throughout the day in a variety of physical activity? For preschooler and school children, we also asked about the types of planned and structured activities. For school children, We retain a modified version of the previously validated questionnaire, namely Physical Activity Questionnaire for older children. Children were asked 10 questions related to their physical activity in the last 7 days, and the physical activity score was calculated from these 10 questions to allow us to have a picture of their general physical activity level. One of the new undertakings of SEANUTS II is the assessment of physical activity using Accelerometer in subsample. In a subsample between 10 to 30% of the total sample depending on countries, children aged between 3 to 12 years were asked to wear an accelerometer, namely gene active on their non-dominant wrist for 7 24 hours days. So gene active is a lightweight waterproof device, and as you can see in the picture on your left, gene active looks and feels like a typical watch, except that it doesn't show time. So this is the general protocol of using gene active. First, each gene active device was battery charged and initialized to start recording at future time at 100 Hz sampling frequency. On the school day or contact day with the children, that is day 1, children were asked to wear the waterproof watch on their non-dominant wrist for 7 24 hours days. So that includes time during their shower, water activities, and sleep. This enables us to capture the time spent in sleep, sedentary, and physical activity in the weekdays and weekend days. On day 8, the device is collected back from the children, and the data recorded in GeneActive was extracted using GeneActive PC software. This data was subsequently analyzed using open source software packages called the GGIR. From the use of both questionnaire and accelerometry, we will be able to obtain information on the overall physical activity level of children based on PAC-C score, their relative score in different domains of activity, and the average acceleration metrics derived from accelerometer as an objective measure of total volume of physical activity. Based on self-report and accelerometry data, we are also able to measure the adherence of children to the WHO guidelines, and we can have an insight on the types of structured activities and the duration spent in different intensity of physical activity. Altogether, these physical activity data allows us to explore the influence of physical activity on health outcome of interest. In particular, with the 24-hour data from Accelerometer, we will be able to examine the interactions and the codependency of 24 hours movement behaviors, not just physical activity, but including also sleep and sedentary behavior. As a summary, to understand physical activity of children in SEANUTS II, we continue to use previously validated questionnaire to allow us to describe overall physical activity and monitor the changes in trends of physical activity for school children. We introduce summary questions to enable us to measure adherence to the latest physical activity guidelines by WHO. For objective measure of physical activity, we collected 7-day accelerometry data in a subsample of children, which enable us to get more detailed, complete picture of physical activity. By adopting raw accelerometer data processing, we will be able to derive population independent metrics such as average acceleration metrics to represent the volume of physical activity. Finally, we hope that we will be able to share with you the findings of physical activity of children in near future, which can be used to measure adherence to guidelines and to inform policies and programs to improve physical activity of children in Southeast Asia. Last but not least, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my sincere acknowledgement for funders, FrieslandCampina, and all parties and individuals who have contributed to the success of SEANUTS II. Thank you.